Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all back to this 11th annual Sacred Trust Talks and Book Signing events presented by the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park. The Gettysburg Foundation is the nonprofit partner to the National Park Service here in Gettysburg and is very proud to collaborate with the Gettysburg National Military Park to invite renowned Civil War historians, authors, National Park Service rangers, licensed battlefield guides, and experts each year to share their unique perspectives on the Battle of Gettysburg and the American Civil War with you, our visitors. Our next speaker, Dr. John Marszalek, will present Lincoln and his military. In his latest book of the same name, Dr. Marszalek investigates and evaluates Abraham Lincoln as a war president and delves into what Lincoln's military problems were during the Civil War and how he managed them. Dr. Marszalek is the W.L. Gillies Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Mississippi State University. He is currently Executive Director and Managing Editor of the Ulysses S. Grant Association's Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Co-Executive Director of the Historians of the Civil War Western Theater. He is a specialist in the Civil War, the Jacksonian period, and race relations, and is the author or editor of 16 books and over 500 articles, chapters, and book reviews. He has lectured widely throughout the nation and has appeared on several national television and radio stations. 3 of his books have been History Book Club selections, and his first book, Court Martial, has been made into a Showtime motion picture and reissued as a paperback. He has received numerous teaching awards, and the Mississippi Historical Society presented him with its highest award, the B.L.C. Wileys Award for the National Distinction in History. In 2014, the MSU College of Arts and Sciences awarded him the first Robert E. Wolverton College Legacy Award, and he is also a U.S. Army Vietnam veteran. I'd like for you to join me in welcoming Dr. John Marszalek.
Well, thank you very much. That's a great introduction. I mean, if I'd have known that I was talking here, I'd be here today. I mean, after that introduction, thank you. I do want to talk to you today about Lincoln and the military, which is part of the Lincoln Library series of Southern Illinois University Press. It's a series of books, brief books. The idea being that we're all very busy today and we just don't have the time to read the doorstops. So this is a book of about 150 to 175 pages, but it's something that you can read. And I hoped in that book that I have said something that might be of interest to you. But I'm going to do a little commercial here first to invite you all to join the Ulysses S. Grant Association. We are an association of people who study Ulysses S. Grant. We're professionals. We're Civil War buffs. We meet every year. We do a lot of things. Mostly, we have edited the 32 volumes of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant, and we're now doing the first, believe it or not, first scholarly edition of the memoirs. So I'd urge you to join us. Go on our website, easy to find, www.usgrantlibrary.org. Look that up, and you'll find all the information that you need. And also come to see us. We love to have people come and see the wonderful things that we have. But let's talk about Abraham Lincoln now that I've given my commercial. When Lincoln became president of the United States, as you know, the nation had already split in 2. The slave states of the South had broken away and had even unified together in what was being called the Confederate States of America under the leadership of a Mississippian, Jefferson Davis. So the moment that Grant becomes president, he's got a difficult problem. He's got a new nation splitting off the United States, and he has a talented opponent in Jefferson Davis. Now, Davis, as you may know, was a graduate of West Point, and he never let people forget that. He was a hero of the Mexican War, and in truth, he was one of the best secretaries of war the nation had had up to that point, and some people argue up to the present day, as long as we had a War Department. Now, look at Lincoln. Just the opposite. Lincoln's sole military experience was his membership in his local militia company, the 31st Illinois Regiment. And he spent a grand total of 30 days on active duty in the Black Hawk War of the 1830s. The men of this, and you have to say, was a motley unit. The men of this unit elected him their company captain. And keep in mind that Lincoln said till the end of his life, this was one of the proudest moments of his life, being elected captain of this company by his neighbors. Well, Lincoln had no military experience, none at this time. And he soon demonstrated just how little he knew about the military. Story is told that he's drilling his unit, and he's marching them up and down, and he encounters a fence with only a small opening in it. He doesn't know what to do. How's he going to get them through that small opening? So thinking quickly, what he does is he stops them, makes them halt, dismisses them, and tells them to reform on the other side of the fence. Another time, Lincoln disobeyed a regimental order not to fire a weapon anywhere near the campgrounds. Well, he fired a weapon close to the campgrounds. He was put under arrest for a day. Abraham Lincoln was in a hoosegow for a day. Another time, this motley unit stole some wine and whiskey. And needless to say, they weren't in any shape to march the next day. Once again, Lincoln's arrested. This time, he's sentenced to wear the badge of officer incompetence. And what that was a wooden sword, a large wooden sword that they wrapped around, and you had to walk around, and everybody knew you were a terrible, terrible officer. Well, those are pretty, not exactly monuments to Lincoln's ability as a military leader, but the important thing is he gained the respect of his men. He gained the respect of his men. And he also felt duty-bound to re-enlist as a private in another unit after his 30 days were up, that unit that he was captain of. Now, the point is, though, Lincoln saw no combat in those 60 days. And he was proud of his military service, proud that he was a member of the military, but later on in his life, when he was a member of the United States Congress from Illinois, he joked on the floor of the House of Representatives about being a military hero. Quote, "I had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. I had a good many struggles with the mosquitoes, and although I never fainted from the loss of blood, I can truly say I got very hungry." That's his evaluation of his service. But keep in mind what happens when Lincoln gets back to New Salem. When he gets back to New Salem, Illinois, after this short service in the military, he runs for political office. There were a total of 300 votes cast in New Salem in that election. Lincoln received 277 of those 300 votes. People had obviously not heard about the sword, about the whiskey, about anything else. They'd heard nothing but good things about Lincoln as a military leader and about his stint in the military. Well, as I mentioned, Lincoln was in the House of Representatives. Another problem he has militarily, in addition to this lack of military service, is that he's an opponent of the American entry into the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s. His opponents in every election, including the presidential election of 1860, tarred him with the brush of voting against supplies for the boys in the field. Can you think of anything worse that you can say about a political opponent? He votes against supplying the American boys who are already out in the field. He insisted, and he was right. He never did that. Didn't matter. The accusation was there. The accusation was there. So in total, when Lincoln becomes President of the United States in 1861, he has little military experience. He's got an anti-war reputation. He doesn't think the United States should be involved in this war. And even worse, he has this reputation of starving the boys who had been sent into this combat that he opposed. So he doesn't really have anything to fall back on as to military experience or anything to do with the military. The thing about Lincoln that I think has to be emphasized is that when he entered the executive mansion, and they didn't call it the White House then, they called it the executive mansion, in 1861, Lincoln was smart enough to realize his own deficiencies in things military. So what did he do? He tried to catch up as much as he can, tried to do what he'd done all his life, learn. He withdrew military books from the Library of Congress. And one of the leading books that he took out was a book written by one of his later generals, Henry W. Halleck, a man who was considered the great American military mind. He asked advice to Lincoln from the man who was going to be his commanding general, Winfield Scott. He even asked the man who he replaced in the White House, James Buchanan, what advice do you have militarily? Buchanan pointed out to Lincoln that he said something to the effect that, be sure when you get drinking water, get it from the right side of the White House, not the left side of the White House, because the water tastes better there. That was the total amount of his military advice. He talked to anybody that was willing to listen to him, asking for advice on how he might take care of his military duties. Now, keep in mind, too, something very crucial. Lincoln doesn't have a whole lot of time. He becomes president in early March. Remember that you don't take office in January you don't take office in March. I'll try again. You don't take office in January until later, until the Roosevelt year, Franklin Roosevelt. At this particular time, you take office in March. And the reason for it is it's a long way to travel to Washington. Roads aren't very good. So you were elected in November. You take office in March. Well, that's not a whole lot of time. As you know, it's in April that Fort Sumter is fired on. So basically, Lincoln is in office a little bit more than a month before he has to decide what's he going to do about Fort Sumter. Keep in mind, too, he's got another problem he's got to deal with, even before Fort Sumter, and that's his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward. Seward was supposed to be the nominee of the Republican Party. It was a done deal. He was going to be the new president. Well, he wasn't. He loses to Lincoln. But he and so many other Americans thought Lincoln was nothing but a bumpkin. He doesn't know what he's doing. So Seward writes the famous letter to Lincoln, which is usually called the April Fool's Day letter because it was sent on April 1st. And Seward in this letter says, don't worry about it, Lincoln. I know there's no policy. You don't have a domestic policy. You don't have a foreign policy. You don't have a military policy, but don't worry. I'll take it over. I'll decide what we need to do, and I'll make sure it happens. So I'll take control of the administration, and you just step aside. Well, Lincoln lets him know what he thinks of that idea. But he still has the problem of Fort Sumter. Well, Lincoln demonstrates something he's going to demonstrate throughout the war. He's not going to act precipitously. Not only did he ask for advice from people like General Winfield Scott, he asked advice from his cabinet. And most importantly, he tested the waters of public opinion to gauge what was the average American thinking. What did he want to see happen? You know, we've all heard stories about Lincoln sitting there morning after morning as these office seekers come into his office. Say, what a waste of time. Lincoln didn't think it was a waste of time. He got to know what the average man was thinking. And he wanted to know that. He knew nothing could happen unless he had public opinion behind him. So, the result, as you know, was a messy decision. Because so many people had so many different ideas. But eventually, it was successful. Lincoln sent resupply ships to relieve the troops under Robert Anderson at Fort Sumter, while at the same time promising the governor of South Carolina that he will not attack that installation at Fort Sumter. And really, he's not dealing with the governor of South Carolina. He's dealing with Jefferson Davis. And what he does is he outmaneuvers the much more experienced Jefferson Davis. The result was that the Confederacy fired the first shot in anger. It wasn't Lincoln. It was somebody else. It was the Confederacy. It fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War resulted from the fact that the Confederates started the war. So the burden rested on Jefferson Davis and the Confederates. Now, some later historians have argued, you've probably heard this story, that Lincoln actually maneuvered the Confederates into firing the first shot. And so he should take the blame for the beginning of the Civil War. Well, I don't think that was the case. The Confederates fired the first shot because of their anxiety over what might happen if they don't take action. And they were particularly concerned about the future of slavery. Future of slavery. And they realized that the war was going to come, and it was going to be over slavery. So keep in mind that the Confederates, in their anxiety, go first. In fact, there's a letter, of all places, in Cleveland, Ohio, in the Western Reserve Historical Society, of a letter from Jefferson Davis to Braxton Bragg. Braxton Bragg at this time is commander at Fort Pickens. And Jefferson Davis says to Bragg, Bragg, I want you to maneuver the Union troops into attacking us first so we can blame them for the cause of the Civil War. Problem was, they didn't get their act together because the Confederates on the Atlantic coast acted before Bragg could even do anything. What we know about Bragg, who knows what he'd have done anyway, but that's another story. Well, the war is begun. And Lincoln still has the big problem. How am I, with no experience, going to be commander-in-chief of all the Union troops? I got to learn how to be commander-in-chief. It's a very slow process. It has all sorts of twists and turns to it. But here's the point, I think. The key point is Lincoln is determined that he is going to manage the war according to the Constitution. that he was going to use the power and the material that he has constitutional authority to use to win the war and thus to preserve the Union. And as the war goes on, he comes to see that in order to win the war, preserve the Union, he's got to destroy slavery, that which caused the war in the first place. So basically, you can just picture Lincoln on a swinging tightrope, you know, and it's swinging back and forth, and he's making it swing because he's on top of it. If he goes too far to one side or too far to the other side, he's going to fall off. So he's got to figure out a way to avoid military disaster, falling off the tightrope. So Lincoln's balancing act between preservation of the Union, the elimination of slavery, and doing all of this within the powers he has as in the American Constitution, that he has as president within the American Constitution. So he's got a big problem right from the start. How is he going to do this? Well, we said earlier that Lincoln has practically no experience, limited experience. Some people argue, well, he was in the Black Hawk War, so he at least knew what it was like to camp outdoors, you know. And I don't think that's a good argument. I think that doesn't give him the kind of experience he's going to need as commander-in-chief. But in any case, at the start of the war, as you know, and I've already said, Lincoln reaches out to everybody. And importantly, too, he sees the military leaders, the generals, as the experts. I'm not an expert in this, Lincoln says, but you generals are. What should I do? So he talked to people like Winfield Scott, George McClellan, Henry W. Halleck, the great name in military theory, Ambrose Burnside, Joe Hooker, William Rosecrans, George Meade, Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman. These are just the most famous ones. They all have one thing in common, among other things. They have a lot of things in common, but this is particularly important. These generals all graduated from West Point. They're all graduates of West Point. At West Point, it's primarily an engineering school. So they learn a lot about engineering. They don't learn a lot about strategy and tactics. But they learn a little bit. And what they learn is based on the writings of a Swiss soldier who fought with Napoleon, started the Russian West Point later, Antoine-Henri Jomini, Jomini. We talk about Jominian tactics, the Jominian strategy. Now, all of these generals followed the teachings of Jomini. And what did Jomini say should happen? You as a general, here's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to so maneuver masses of your troops, maneuver them in such a way that they will be facing fractions of the enemy. You know, 60,000 on your side and 222 on the other side. That's ideal situation with Jomini. It doesn't happen, of course. But the important thing is that if you do that, what are the 222 going to do? They're going to say, I surrender, I quit. So if you do this right, if you maneuver properly, if you've got enough troops against the enemy, against a small number of enemy, they'll quit. You won't even have to fight a battle. It'll happen. It'll just happen. Well, early on, Lincoln, with no military experience, started thinking, this does not make a lot of sense. Doesn't make a lot of sense. He came to see that Union troops were bigger. There were more of them than the Confederates. So Why would you want to maneuver your masses and try to get them against fractions? Because the Confederates, all they have to do is maneuver themselves, and suddenly it's mass against mass. It's not mass against fractions. So that's not a good idea. Not a good idea at all. Better, says Lincoln, attack simultaneously all along the line, strategically and tactically. Don't maneuver, just attack all along the defense line. What will this do? This will keep the Confederates from being able to maneuver. Because if you're massing troops and you're attacking here on the left side, what do? They move the troops on the right side over to the left side. But if you attack all along the line, you can't be moving your troops. Because if you move troops from the right to the left, you're going to lose that one side. So better to have the Federals attack simultaneously all along the line, taking advantage of numerical advantages to prevent the Confederates from moving troops around to beat back these singular attacks. Well, Lincoln's got no military experience, but he's figured this out, that we can't continue to fight a war in a Jominian way. We've got to do a new war. The Union war effort has to be waged in a new way. And so he keeps telling his generals, here's the way we need to do it, generals. And what do? They regularly ignore him. How many people have heard the story about McClellan saying, I don't have enough soldiers. Need more soldiers. Why does he need more soldiers? So he'll have a mass that he can maneuver against fractions of the enemy. And the issue is, how big a mass should you have? That's the question. McClellan says this much. Somebody else may say this much. Well, so his generals, and that's just one, regularly ignore his thinking. Halleck basically says the same thing. So the generals, the Union generals, under Lincoln, continue to fight the war, or try to fight the war in the same way. They refuse to see that they have some advantages they have to take advantage of. And this frustrates Lincoln to no end. Now, we know Lincoln had a revolving door list of generals. And I read you that long list, and he goes through, particularly here in the Eastern theater of the war, he's constantly changing generals. And he continues to do this because there's another issue that these generals all have learned at West Point, that the way you win the war, you maneuver masses against fractions to do what? To capture a strategic place, to capture a river, capture a railroad junction, capture something that's important. For example, another example, you capture Richmond, and you make sure that you don't lose Washington, because places are more important than anything else. If you capture a place, what is going to happen is you are going to win the war, because you now have the capital, you now have the railroad, you now have everything. Take a look at what Halleck does at Corinth. Takes him 30 days to get from Shiloh to Corinth. When he gets there, what does he find? Beauregard and the Confederates have gone. That's okay. Halleck says, that's fine, but I've captured Corinth. And by the way, he said, I've done it bloodlessly. And his soldiers agreed. You've all heard that story that he had a nickname, Halleck did, Old Brains. He didn't get that name until Corinth. People say, oh, he got the name because you wrote this book. He got the name because the soldiers were so thrilled that they captured Corinth, and they weren't, many of them, killed. Okay, so Lincoln says that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is this. You fight the war all along the line, and your purpose is not to capture Richmond, your purpose is to destroy the Confederate Army. You keep battering the other side until there's no opposition left, until the Confederacy has no army left to continue the effort. And the third thing that Lincoln really was insistent on, war is no longer just between armies. War is between societies. You don't just have Lee fighting Grant. You have the Confederacy fighting the United States. His soldiers, his generals did not see them. So, over a period of time, and this doesn't happen immediately, it's probably in the second year of the war or so, Lincoln comes to see that the Federals have to stop fighting a gentlemanly-like war. Fighting a Jominian war. And they had to wage the conflict more completely across the board in a modern way. Well, why didn't this just happen? Because Lincoln did not have any generals who understood what he was saying until Grant and Sherman came to the fore. It was Grant and Sherman reaching positions of Army authority who understood what Grant was talking about. He had to keep appointing generals until he found the generals who would understand what he's saying. And by the way, people say, well, why didn't he appoint Grant sooner? Because Grant wasn't ready. I don't believe Grant was ready to be commanding general until about the time, until he had the experience that he had developed. And what had he learned in the war? He learned that you've got to fight the war simultaneously. You have to destroy the other army, and you got to keep moving. You've got to keep moving. Well, Lincoln looks at this war, and he quickly sees that war was changing. It's not the same war that began at Fort Sumter. And he knew that he couldn't win the war simply by winning victories in the field. He had to deal with all the issues that were present in the war. And he came to see that slavery was a major, major, major issue. He came to believe that slavery was an evil that the United States had to eradicate. And maybe more importantly for the war effort, he came to see that slavery was actually helping the Confederacy, because every slave that was forced to work in a field meant one white Southerner who did not have to work on the field. So he came to see that if the United States is going to win this war, they've got to attack slavery. But remember what I said. He believed this had to be done constitutionally. So he had to level a constitutional attack, a constitutionally legal attack on the institution of slavery. Because what does the Constitution say? The Constitution says slavery is legal in the United States. So what does he do? How does he begin the attack on slavery? He issues the Emancipation Proclamation, stating that the president had, as part of his war powers, had the authority to eradicate slavery as something that was adding to the strength of the Confederacy. So, Lincoln couldn't eliminate slavery every place, but he could say, hey, I'm going to eliminate slavery in any place. Part of my war powers, which I have, I believe, in the Constitution. I'm going to eradicate slavery in those areas still in rebellion against the United States as of January 1st, 1863. But he did something else. something even more important, some people argue. He used the Emancipation Proclamation as a way to bring black males into the Union Army. We heard earlier today about the various numbers of black soldiers and black sailors. Lincoln was convinced, and so was Grant, and so was Sherman, that you could not win this war unless you eliminated slavery on the Confederate side, and then you added those freed slaves to the Union side. Well, he left behind, did Lincoln, way behind, the traditional war of mass and maneuver on the battlefield. And he turned to a war of simultaneous enemy, army, and societal destruction. You have an amazing thing happening here, do you not? Lincoln begins the war asking his generals to teach him. Very soon into the war, by September of 1862, at least, he is now teaching his generals how they should fight this war. And he proves to be a pretty good teacher. He settles on Grant and Sherman as his leaders because they knew exactly what he was talking about, and they implemented his doctrines. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and say Lincoln was an absolutely perfect war general, a war president, perfect war leader. And it's true that unlike his Confederate counterpart, Jefferson Davis, he did not have the credentials of a military leader. But the big thing about Lincoln is he understood his limitations. He recognized his limitations, and he's willing to learn. He's willing to grow. He's willing to develop. He's willing to see that things change. They don't stay the same. And if you're going to be successful in war effort, or any effort for that matter, you've got to be able to deal with change. The winner in any war, and one could trace any war in American history, the winner in any war is the individual or the side, but let's just talk about the individual. The individual who approaches the chaos of the battlefield and the politics of the nation's capital with an open mind and with a determination to learn and to grow. Lincoln did that. Throughout the war, he learns, and he learns well. He becomes a successful wartime president as a result. And thus, in his own words, said here at Gettysburg, quote, "This nation under God have a new birth of freedom," close quote. We know, because we have the advantage of being on the other side of the Civil War, we know the United States stayed whole. The Union was saved. We also know in order to save the Union, slavery had to be eradicated. And I would disagree slightly with your previous speaker, Dr. Edgerton, whose book, by the way, is a wonderful book on the wars of Reconstruction. But I think, you like what ifs. What if Lincoln had lived? The big thing about Lincoln, instead of Andrew Johnson, Johnson knew all the answers. Charles Sumner knew all the answers. Lincoln didn't. Yes, he had some ideas, but he would have directed Reconstruction in a way that it would not have been the political disaster that it turned out to be. And Dr. Edgerton is correct in everything else he said, I think. But in any case, Abraham Lincoln, the unlearned militiaman, within 4 years becomes the best military president in American history. And he leads the nation to survival. Thank you very much. Sure. I'd be happy to answer any questions if they're not too hard.
Although there's no doubt that Grant saw what Lincoln wanted to do, the enemy was the Army, not places, yet his total experience before that was trying to get Vicksburg, which is a place. How do you explain that?
Okay, that's very true. Everybody hear the question? How come Grant came out, went out to Vicksburg to capture
The place, no question about that. But I think what does happen, remember what happens after, at Vicksburg is a magnificent military victory. I mean, it's still studied by our military and others because of the amazing things that Grant did. But notice what happened after Vicksburg. He goes to Chattanooga. And at Chattanooga, he knows that Chattanooga is an important place too. But he also sees that the way to win that battle at Chattanooga was to do it in such a way that you get rid of Braxton Bragg's army. So when he goes to Virginia, one of the first things he does, he and Sherman meet, and Grant says to Sherman, basically, look, Sherman, here's what we're going to do. We're going to sit down and we're going to plan the rest of the war. And here's what the plan is going to be. You're going to keep pressure on Joe Johnston constantly. I'm going to keep pressure on Lee, and we'll have people fighting in all other areas, all at the same time. All at the same time. And so by the time he gets to Virginia, he's come to see that capturing the place isn't going to be enough. He's got to do something about the Army. Now, you can argue, I think, too, that Sherman's orders, you remember, were to stay close to Joe Johnston. Don't let him break away so he'll come and help Lee in Virginia. But what does Sherman end up doing? Sherman ends up being more concerned about Atlanta than he is about Joe Johnston's army. But what does Sherman learn in the process? He learns in the process that the only way to win this war is to convince the Southerners, who he knows very well because he spent most of his time before the war there, that he's got to prove to them, to show them they don't have a prayer. Psychological warfare. So I think the question is an excellent question, and brief answer after this long-winded answer. I think what it comes down to is they all learn this at different times. But I think Lincoln understands that Grant and Sherman will pick up on that better than anybody else will. Somebody.
John, I think that
Oops. You better watch it.
John, I think that the Overland campaign is a great example of what you were talking about. But we end up with basically three leaders in the East, with Halleck is still in charge of the Army in Washington. Grant is in charge of something out there, and Meade is still in charge of the Army of the Potomac. How do you reconcile that having three leaders at one time?
Very good. One of the things that we didn't get into or maybe touched on, but the Civil War has got a lot of politics in it too. Lincoln understands better than Jefferson Davis that he's got to convince public opinion, popular opinion, that a war has to be fought in certain ways. The most amazing thing to me is Halleck. Point you make about Halleck. Halleck, who is a Jominian, who wrote the book, for heaven's sakes, American book on Jominianism, but even he comes to see that here's how we got to fight the war. Stanton agrees with Lincoln. He'll go along with Lincoln, and Lincoln wants to fight the war this particular way. And so what they basically do, and you notice what happens when Grant takes over from Halleck. Halleck is not fired. What does Lincoln do with Halleck? He makes him the equivalent of what today roughly is called chief of staff. Better way of putting it, he puts Halleck in charge of supply, logistics. He puts Halleck in charge of being the go-between between the administration, Stanton, Lincoln, and Grant. As for Meade, Grant sees that if he goes into the Eastern Army as a Westerner and takes over, he's going to have morale problems. And he likes Meade. So he lets Meade actually give the commands, but he gives the commands to Meade. By the end of the war, in the last 2 or 3 months of the war, he's not even going through Meade anymore. He's making the decision. So why is that? I think Lincoln, remember that book, Team of Rivals, where Doris Kearns Goodwin says that the cabinet of all different kind of people, but Lincoln brings them together. I think he does the same thing with the military. He brings all these people, and somehow, and if you know the answer to this, let me know, but somehow he gets them to work together. You can get Halleck and Stanton working together. You've accomplished an enormous, enormous thing. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Sherman, I think, is interesting in his relationship with Lincoln's philosophy, in that Sherman, and I think particularly after he has the disappointment at Kennesaw Mountain, and maybe even prior at Missionary Ridge, I think Sherman becomes more of a Johnsonist in a sense that he tries to maneuver to get portions of Johnston's army in positions where he can handle them. We know also that, of course, Sherman very reticent to suffer casualties after Kennesaw Mountain.
Yeah.
But he then is, in a sense, is a Lincoln person, and is, as you said, with his philosophy on the handling the people of the South, the general population, and working towards them. Would you agree pretty much with that summary?
Yeah, I think what's that old thing? Yeah, I agree with some, I don't agree with some, you know. So no matter what I say, I'm covered here. The thing about Sherman is an absolutely intriguing individual. What Sherman is attempting to do during the Atlanta campaign is he's trying to outflank Joe Johnston. But every time, and he almost pulls it off at Resaca at the very beginning. If McPherson had just pushed through, who knows? But again, what ifs don't count. But what he tries to do is outmaneuver, outflank Joe Johnston. I argue that what you have in Sherman in the Atlanta campaign and then the March to the Sea is Sherman trying to figure out how best to use traditional warfare with modern warfare. The point is that Sherman is very friendly to Southerners. In fact, after the war, it's the South that wants Sherman to run for president. In 1868, it's Southern newspapers. It's the Adjutant General of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, no, Sons of the Confederacy, that call on Sherman because they think he agrees with them. So this mythology, you know, the lost cause thing and all the rest. But Sherman is thinking in terms of a new kind of warfare too. And keep in mind the amazing thing. You remember in the war in Iraq, the original war in Iraq, Norman Schwarzkopf said that he had based his outflanking of the Iraqis on Sherman's Atlanta campaign. So that's not a good answer, but okay. But anyway, somebody likes it out there.
You had mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation. Is it?
Yeah.
Yes. You had mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation
Right.
from a military perspective.
Yeah.
But from the political perspective, wasn't it an international issue?
Yes. Yes.
Could you expound on that, please?
Sure. Very, very good question. The Emancipation Proclamation, I talked about it as a military thing, but it's also a diplomatic thing, and it's a political thing. The diplomatic thing is whatever we do, we can't allow England and France to come into this war. Because if they come into this war with their navy, with their ships, the Union is in big, big trouble. So that is a point. Politically, however, it's a negative. Because as you know, the election of 1862 is a disaster for the Republican Party. And a lot of people vote against the Republicans because they don't like the idea of an Emancipation Proclamation. They see this as a danger. Several speakers earlier today made the point, and it's an excellent point. Don't ever think that racism exists only below the Mason-Dixon line during the Civil War. It's not the case. There is racism throughout this entire country during the war, during Reconstruction. One of the reasons why the South was able to do what it did was because the North said, okay, you can do it. We really don't want all these black people coming north, so we got to be careful here. So it's a very complex idea. And I just end by saying, I think what we're going to see in the next 10 years as we go through the sesquicentennial of Reconstruction is going to be a lot more revisiting of what Reconstruction really was like. I don't believe that the Civil War ended with Lee and Grant at Appomattox, because the idea was we're going to end this war so there won't be any guerrilla warfare. But what was the Ku Klux Klan, if not a form of guerrilla warfare that continued the war? And it didn't end in 1877. It didn't end at the turn of the century. It didn't end even in the 1930s. So it's going to be an interesting point. One thing I will tell you, it's going to be interesting from the point of view, the Washington Post during the Civil War ran a series of Civil War articles regularly. And this was funded by a corporation. That same corporation will not fund the same thing for Reconstruction because it's too controversial. So we'll see.